Lenin understood it wasn't your numbers that mattered. It wasn't your popular support that mattered. You just paralyze the country by occupying the key points, and then you take over.
All right, so let's talk about 1917. It was a big year for Russia, with not one but two revolutions that changed the nation's path. First, there was the February Revolution, which shook things up and brought down the long-standing Romanov dynasty. Then, just months later, came the October Revolution, led by the Bolsheviks, who had bold ideas for a new Russia. These two revolutions didn't just happen out of nowhere. No, there's a long history, stretching back hundreds of years, that led up to them. So now the questions are, what drove the people to rise up like that? How did one revolution lead to another so quickly? And why did these events change Russia and the world forever? Let's walk through it all and find some answers. For years before 1917, Russia had been a place of struggle. In the early 1900s, it was one of the poorest countries in Europe, with a huge population of peasants and a growing group of poor factory workers. Too much of Western Europe and Russia seemed outdated, stuck in old ways. One reason for this view was serfdom, a system where landless peasants had to work the land for wealthy nobles. While most of Western Europe left serfdom behind centuries earlier, Russia kept it around until the mid-1800s. Finally, in 1861, Russia abolished serfdom, setting the peasants free. This newfound freedom played a big role in what was to come. Now, if we notice, we will see that though Russia abolished serfdom, but Russia's industrial revolution arrived late, much later than it did in Western Europe or the United States. When it finally arrived in the early 1900s, it swept in like a strong wind, bringing huge changes to both society and politics. Around this time, between 1890 and 1910, the population of big Russian cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow nearly doubled. But with so many people crowding into cities so fast, many workers found themselves living in poor and cramped conditions. These new industrial workers faced tough lives in harsh environments, and it wasn't just city life that was hard. A population boom in the late 1800s, Russia's short growing seasons, and a string of costly wars, starting with the Crimean War, led to frequent food shortages across the empire. Then came the terrible famine of 1891 to 1892, which took as many as 400,000 lives. To make matters worse, Russia suffered a painful defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. This loss weakened Russia's military and shook the authority of Tsar Nicholas II. After losing soldiers, money, ships, and respect, Russia's confidence was shattered. Many educated Russians began to look westward, noticing the progress and scientific growth happening in Europe and America. They saw how Russia's slow growth was tied to the tight grip of the Tsar and his aristocratic supporters. And so, the call for change began to echo louder across the land. Soon, large groups of Russian workers began protesting against the monarchy, and these protests led to what we now call the Bloody Sunday Massacre of 1905. On that day, hundreds of unarmed people were killed or injured by the Tsar's soldiers. After the bloody events of 1905 and Russia's harsh defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, Nicholas II made promises. He spoke of granting more freedom of speech and agreed to set up a representative assembly, the Duma, to help bring about change. Then in August 1914, Russia entered World War I, joining forces with the Serbs and their allies, France and Britain. But the war quickly became a nightmare for the Russian Empire. In battle, Russia's forces couldn't keep up with Germany's modern military power, and Russian losses piled up, more than any nation had ever seen in war before. Back home, food and fuel grew scarce, inflation soared, and the already fragile economy struggled under the weight of war costs. In 1915, Tsar Nicholas left Petrograd to lead the army at the front, but even this move would come at a great cost, both to him and to Russia. With Tsar Nicholas away at the front, His wife, Tsarina Alexandra, a German by birth and never fully trusted by the Russian people, took charge. She began replacing elected officials, which didn't sit well with anyone. And during this time, her advisor, Grigory Rasputin, became a powerful figure in Russian politics and gained deep influence over the Romanov family. But Rasputin's growing influence didn't go unnoticed. On December 30th, 1916, Russian nobles who wanted to end his control over the royal family assassinated him. By then, most Russians had lost all faith in the Tsar's leadership. Corruption was everywhere, the economy was weak, and Nicholas kept dismissing the Duma, the weak parliament he had set up after the 1905 revolution, whenever it challenged him. Seeing all this failure, moderates began to join forces with the radicals. Soon, more and more voices rose up, calling for the removal of the powerless Tsar. And the February Revolution starts. The February Revolution got its name because Russia was still using the old Julian calendar at the time, so it began on February 23rd. By that system, March 8th, 1917 on our calendar. It all started when people in Petrograd took to the streets, desperate for bread. They were joined by huge crowds of factory workers on strike. Clashes broke out between the protesters and police, but the people refused to back down and kept filling the streets. On March 11th, troops from the Petrograd army garrison were sent to stop the protests. Some soldiers even fired on the crowds, and a few protesters were killed. But despite the danger, people stayed, and soon the soldiers began to lose their resolve. Seeing the situation escalate, the Duma quickly stepped in and formed a provisional government on March 12th. Just days later, Tsar Nicholas gave up the throne, ending the Romanov rule that had lasted for centuries in Russia. Among the leaders of the provisional government was a young lawyer named Alexander Kerensky. He and his colleagues set up a liberal program that promised rights like freedom of speech, equality before the law, and the right for unions to organise and strike. They were firmly against any kind of violent social revolution. However, as the new Minister of War, Kerensky kept Russia in World War I, even though most people deeply disliked the war. Staying in the fight only made Russia's food problems worse, and hunger kept spreading. Tension grew stronger, with peasants looting farms and food riots breaking out in the cities. On November 6th and 7th, 1917, and October 24th and 25th, by Russia's old Julian calendar, Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin led leftist revolutionaries in a near-bloodless takeover of the provisional government. This event is often remembered as the October Revolution because of the old calendar dates. The provisional government had been formed by Russia's capitalist leaders, but Lenin had a different vision. He called for a Soviet government, one that would be run directly by councils made up of soldiers, peasants and workers. To make this vision real, the Bolsheviks and their allies took control of government buildings and other important locations around Petrograd. Soon after, they set up a new government with Lenin at the helm, making him the leader of the world's first communist state. After the Bolshevik Revolution in late 1917, Russia fell into civil war. The two main sides in the fight were the Red Army and the White Army. The Red Army stood with Lenin's Bolshevik government, fighting to keep control. On the other side, the White Army was a mix of different groups, including monarchists, capitalists, and supporters of democratic socialism, all united against the Bolsheviks. Things took a dark turn on July 16, 1918, when the Bolsheviks executed the Romanov family, ending their centuries-long rule. After years of fighting, the Civil War finally ended in 1923, with Lenin's Red Army victorious, leading to the creation of the Soviet Union, AP-10. With all the violence and unrest, the Russian Revolution set the stage for the rise of communism, a powerful belief system that would spread across the globe. It also marked the beginning of the Soviet Union's rise as a world power, ready to face off with the United States during the Cold War. What do you think was the biggest driving force behind the 1917 revolutions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. See you in our next video. Thanks for watching.